This week in C10, we are going to be going to the next stage in your capstone project and developing interactive prototypes of what your application or service will look like. And to do this, we are going to use an example using an application or service called proto.io. And we're going to use proto.io to develop an interactive prototype of the Instagram application. So over the last few weeks, you've been working through these different stages in developing a more tangible and real picture of what your applicational service will look like. So you've worked from C7 doing sketches, so very rough, very quick sketches of what you imagine or conceive of for your application into something a little bit more concrete, like a wireframe, and finally into static mockups, which over these steps gives you all the details that you would need to develop an interactive prototype, which is what we're focusing on today. So at each of these stages, you're adding a little bit more concrete detail about what your application is going to look like, and you're probably starting to get a much better idea about how the interactive component will begin to work as well. Now, obviously, a sketch is beneficial because you can be very rapid about that. You can hash out lots of different ideas very quickly. And a wireframe is a little bit more time consuming, but because of the work that you do in sketching, you don't waste time on things that aren't of interest or aren't useful. And the same goes for static mocks and prototypes as well. So each of these stages are saving you time at the subsequent step by allowing you to only really focus on what is seeming promising or useful going forward. So at this stage, when you're working on the interactive prototype, you have a very mature idea of what your application is probably going to look like and how it's going to behave. And this is just allowing you to test that in the real world. And when I say test that in the real world, I mean that twofold. So one, you as designers, you get to play around with the application and how it behaves, but also a prototype is useful because it becomes something that you can put in front of other people. So this could be potential users of the application, or it could be other kinds of stakeholders who are invested in the development. So when you develop these interactive prototypes, you can get feedback on how the application looks and behaves in a close to real life situation. So a concept that you need to understand in order to do this is something we call layers. Now, layers are something that you've probably encountered in other kinds of applications, and the process is much the same. So if you've used an application like Keynote or PowerPoint, then you've probably utilized layers to arrange the different visual elements on your slides. And if you've used something like Photoshop or Illustrator, the concept is also seen there as well. So this is where each of the visual components are part of what we call a layer, and the arrangement of those layers, so how high or low they are on the stack, determines what you will see from a user's point of view. So on the left-hand side here, we see a box and a cross in the middle, and this is composed of three different layers that we see on the right-hand side. So from a user's perspective, they see what's on the left, but you as a designer have controlled the different layers and where they are to create this configuration on the right. So when we're designing interactive components and applications, we'll often use what we call assets. An asset can be anything that we use in development of this interactive prototype, and it can also be reused when you're developing the application. But basically, it can be a graphic, any kind of image, text, video that goes into the creation of these UIs. And the best kind of assets are something we call vectors. So vectors are quite different from typical image files. So say a JPEG or another kind of file that you would take with your camera. And usually they are something without backgrounds. and that they can be resized without losing any of their resolution. And this is beneficial because um, you can use that when you're developing your UI to layer on top of one another. So the transparency allows you to put different vector graphics on top of one another, and you see through, and you can collage them into some kind of arrangement. And the resizing ability is useful if you want to change the size of the image later and not want to lose resolution in your prototype. So I talk about this resizing thing. How is that accomplished? Well, when you typically have an image file, you'll often hear somebody talk about the megapixels or the resolution of that file. And generally speaking, an image file is a grid with individual dots or squares, and the information in the file corresponds to each one of those grid points. So information about the color of that particular point, information about how all of those points come together, that's all stored inside the graphic. Now, if you resize a typical image file or a bitmap file, you don't have information for those new grid points that you've created. So a vector graphic is different in that it stores information about the file in a mathematical way. And that means that when you resize the image, you don't lose resolution because the image is recalculated using those mathematical definitions. So that allows you to make those images as big or as small as you want them. And all that's happening is that procedurally, it's regenerating the image based on these definitions. So what is Proto.io? Well, Keynote and PowerPoint, they're extremely useful for testing out different interactive components. And some people use them exclusively, but they do have disadvantages for developing interactive prototypes. And the interactions that you can build in those applications are usually very rigid. You can't add necessarily smooth transitions, and you can't necessarily add, say, a keyboard interaction to your prototypes. So for this reason, a lot of professionals use specific prototyping platforms that were built to get over these problems and make the process easier. And often these applications offer different kinds of benefits, like allowing you to export the files with the bare necessities or the basics for getting started in development. So this can really be a useful next step when developing an actual application. And usually the way that this works is that they add animations to single components that are on these different layers and come with aspects that will allow you to quickly test out different forms of interaction without having to go through the process of rearranging everything. You can just selectively work on certain aspects. So Proto.io uses three different concepts, which we call containers, screens, and states. So a container is usually some reusable component that can contain different elements in the UI. And then you have the screens, which is the different screens in your application's prototype. So a particular part of the application. And the state is usually referring to the state of the components on the screen. So the interactions between these three different elements is usually how you develop the interactive components of your application. So understanding what screen you are on, how it's supposed to behave, and when you tap on this element, what is supposed to happen in another element, say. So if I just bring out Safari here, we can see this side by side. So first of all, I'm going to log into my Proto.io account. And we can see here that I can create a new project. So I have an old one here, and obviously with each of these projects you can delete them and so forth. But what I'm going to do is I'm going to create a new project here. Now on the right hand side here, and this corresponds to this slide, we're going to give it a name. So let's say Instagram demo is the name of our project. And we're going to select iPhone 11 because the assets that we have to work with are taken from an iPhone 11. And this is setting up the screen size of the device. But you can obviously change the size of the device, the type of device, and you can even create a custom one as well. And when we create the project, we'll be taken to a new screen, and this is the landing or home page of proto.io, where we can see a basic screen that we've started with. And on the left-hand side, we have two sections. In the top is either a screens or container section. And then below that is our overview of the layers and how that works. And on the right-hand side, we can save, we can preview, and also we have an area here which is for pre-defined assets that proto.io provides. And we have down here project assets. Now the first thing we're going to do is we're going to add some assets that we've downloaded in this slide. So here on slide 18, you'll be able to download the assets that I'm using here. And if we go browse, you can find these assets here, and they start uploading into the application. So what we're going to do now is we're going to go through the slides one by one, and I'm just going to show you how each of these elements work and how we can bring this blank canvas into something that looks a lot more like Instagram as we expect it. So in this first part, we're going to just go over containers, how to create containers, vertical scrolling, horizontal scrolling, a transition with a button, and animation. So first of all, containers. As you can probably guess, in this top left-hand side here, we have a link or a tab rather for containers. And what we can do is we can create containers here. So to just give you a quick demonstration of what containers look like, I'm going to create a new container, and I can resize that container very much as you would do with any other application using the guides. And when I go to the predefined library, I'm going to drop in a shape, just dragging and dropping into this container. And we're just going to call it for now test button. Now, right now, this button doesn't do anything. We can't tap it. It doesn't even appear on our screen. So we're now going to have to work with this and turn it into something more useful. So first of all, you'll notice on the bottom here that when I'm selecting this, I have something called container states and state transitions. So right now, this button is gray. So we're going to call this the off state of the button. But what I want to do is I want to create another state for this button where it's on. And so I can go new container state, and it creates another state that is exactly the same, but is distinctly different. And I can switch between them and you won't see a difference for the moment. But we're going to name this one on state, and we're going to select the oval, and we're going to change the background of that oval to green. That's why. So we're going to change it to green. Now, what happens is when I switch between these two different states, you can now see that they're two distinct versions of the same container. And you'll notice when I click on this, I have a little lightning icon. And this is for creating these interactions that we're going to build up. Now, when I'm in the off state, I want it to be that when I tap on this, I go to the on state. So I click on the lightning and it gives me a little tail that I can drag down to the on state. And you'll notice here it's saying, do you want to create a transition? So do you want me to go from this state to that state? And I say, yes. And you can see it appears on the top here. So on tap, so when somebody taps this, change the state of test button. And you can also see there's a little preview here of what that transition will look like. So in the same way, we can go back to container states and we can go to on, but there isn't any interaction for the on state. We need to add, in the same way that we did with the other one, an association with the off state. So now this button that we've created, very basic, can go from two different states. It can go from an on to an off and an off to an on. And when we go to the screen, you'll notice that we don't see it. And that's because the screen and the containers are different. So we need to drag our container containing the button onto this screen that we have here. So we first make sure that we've selected the screen and we go to the containers and then we can drag this here. And this is an element that we can resize. And what I'm going to do is put that there. Now, because it's a container, we can reuse it. So I can actually drag another button here. And without having to rebuild that, I can actually have two distinct buttons. And you can see now that that change is reflected in the screen. So I could be looking at the container itself, but when I go back to the screen, it has both of these containers. Now, if I hit save and I go preview, you can now see that we have one button, two buttons, and I can switch them on and off. And what you can do with these state transitions is much like you would do in a slideshow. You can change how those transitions occur. So maybe you want them to slide in. Maybe you want them to behave differently to certain actions. So we can go here and we can say, choose the container that we want to. We can tell it to do different things and so on and so forth. So when you're designing your application, you'll find lots of different ways that you can change the properties of your animations or your containers to do different things. So next we're going to look at vertical scrolling. So we don't need our button anymore, so we can get rid of that. And now we're going to start building something that looks a lot more like Instagram. So to create the vertical scroll, we're going to have to start by giving our screen here a name. So this is going to be our home screen. And you'll see in the assets here, I actually have an asset that is our home screen from Instagram. So this is just a regular screenshot of Instagram. And I can resize that so that it fits my screen. And that texture will pop in a moment. And so if I go save and preview, the application is going to look like Instagram, but it's not going to do anything because it's not interactive. This is just a screenshot in the background. So to make it more interactive, I need to actually add more elements or more containers. Now, when it comes to the design of Instagram, the scrolling component happens in this space here. So what I'm going to do is I'm first going to create a rectangle, because when I add the scrolling component over the top, I don't want to see this background image in the background. So I have a rectangle that covers that space. And I'm going to change the background itself to white. So that now we have a very clear space in the middle. Now, what I want to do is I want to add the vertical scrolling element here. So what I need to do is create a new container, which I'm going to call feed. And we'll go to our assets. And you'll see that we actually have a long vertical image that is stitched together from multiple screenshots. That is our feed. So again, I can resize that. And put it onto our container. But as you can see, it's still quite long. It's much longer than the container itself. So what we can do is we can right click, and we have an option here to convert to scrollable container. Now on the right hand side here it says scroll, and you have the option for horizontal, which I can show you in a bit, vertical and omnidirectional. So now we have this scrolling element, which once we go back to the screen, we can say drag this feed container onto the screen. And it will create a scrolling feed. Let me just do a quick preview. And you'll see we can now actually scroll this up and down, but we've still got a problem because this screenshot still has all the stuff at the top, which we are duplicating from our other screenshot. So we can go back and we can go to our container, and quite simply, we just push the image a little bit higher so that we don't have to see it. So now with that change, when we go back to the screen, we don't see that duplicate at the top. And so you can probably imagine that what we can also do is create containers that have horizontal scrolling. So we'll just switch to the horizontal scrolling. So in the same concept, we can go to containers and we can drag this horizontal bar here into our feed container. And again, we can resize it so that it covers where that is on our screenshot. And then we can say, convert to a scrollable container and pick horizontally. Now, as you noticed, it recognized that this image was longer vertically and this image was longer horizontally, so it actually already picked it automatically. And so also you can see on the left-hand side that our horizontal scroll is above the feed image here. So it has the proper layering as well. So now when we save and preview, not only do we have this vertical scrolling feed here, we can actually go left and right on this as well. But what about if you want to switch screens? So some of you may probably already see where this is going, but you can create a new screen. And let's say that this screen is going to be for a profile page. And again, I can go to the library, go to the assets that I already have, and I actually have a screenshot here already of a profile page. So just like with the home screen, you can give it a basic look to begin with by using this screenshot as a background. Now, normally what would happen is that when you're using an application like Instagram, you would click on one of these buttons at the bottom, and that would take you to the profile page or take you back to the home page and so forth. So what we're going to do is we're going to add what we call an interaction area here. So starting by going back to the home screen, we go to the library and we add by dragging and dropping an interaction area and put it over the profile icon. And we can resize that just to make sure that that button area is not covering everything, but generous enough that it would register a tap. Now, you'll notice that we can also add states and interactions to this area. Even though it doesn't appear visibly in the application preview, we can add an interaction and say to it, well, go to Profile as a name, and we want to change the state of the screen or go to screen. And in this case, we want to go to the profile screen. And we can do different kinds of transitions. And in this case, we'll do a slide to the right. So we can save and preview. And we still have our scrolling left and right, up and down, but now we can tap on the profile and it would take us to a profile page. But notice I can't go back because I haven't added an interaction area on this screen. So we can quickly change that by going to our profile screen, going to the library, and adding another interaction area, same as before, just covering that space. We can make sure it's selected, add a new interaction, let's say go to home as a name. We want to go to a screen, we want to go to the home, and we also want to have this particular sliding effect, and again on tap, go to screen home. So now saving and previewing, we can scroll up and down, we can scroll left and right, we can go to a profile, but we can also go back to the home page as well. So for the last part of this section, we're going to look at adding an animation to this like symbol. So when we go to the containers and we go to the feed container, we want to be able to add a button almost over this heart symbol. So we can start by, same as before, adding a space over this, just making sure that we're covering up the actual background, but roughly the same size as the icons that are already there. And what I want to do is create a container from this as well. And we're going to call this like button. And so we can go to that like button, can zoom in a lot more. And we just make sure that our background is white. We go to the library, and just like we did with the oval here at the beginning, we're going to create different states. So the first state is the white heart, so nothing is changed or different. This is the default state that we want. and we'll just call this white heart. But now we also want a new state, and for that we're going to drag the red heart over the top. And just like we did before, we're going to associate each of these states so that when you tap, it takes you to the other version. So we want to go from a white heart to a red heart. So on tap, change state to red heart. We can see a preview of that here. And then if we decided to change our mind, we can also go from the red heart to the white heart. Now, because we've been editing this container here, we should actually be able to see this appear in the feed container, because we're editing this container and this container is held inside feed. So if we go to the screens, we save and preview. Again, up and down scrolling, left and right scrolling, profile, home page. But the difference is that when I tap on the heart here, it's actually changing red to white, white to red. So that's everything for part one. And now we can go into adding a few more details.